To Sutubra Research, reimagining energy is all in the numbers, and the numbers don't lie. This consulting firm helps their clients make better decisions about decarbonizing their energy systems by looking at the big data. Their expertise lies in applying mathematics and crunching the numbers using complex systems to help make smart energy decisions. Coming up next is Cameron Wade. Hi, Cameron. Welcome.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be with you.
So tell me a little bit about you and how Sutubra Research began.
Sure. So, a little bit about me. I kind of come from the math and physics world. That's where I did kind of all my bachelor's and master's education, learning a lot about kind of the low level equations of how this world works and so on. But was also always sort of fascinated with, say, energy and kind of decarbonization. Um, After my master's, I worked briefly at the European Space Agency doing kind of mathematical modeling of some, cool stuff for outer space applications, which was really interesting and kind of got me into more of the kind of computer programming sort of space, which will matter in a minute. But then I left to go do a PhD at the University of Victoria in a field sort of, not in math or physics, but in kind of energy system modeling, which is what Sutubra does. And so I'm sure we'll, kind of do a deep dive into the modeling aspect. But I was there for a couple of years, learning a lot about kind of power systems, decarbonization, energy systems, economics, that sort of stuff, which was fairly new to me. But kind of applying kind of mathematical modeling to it. And then an opportunity came up to do some modeling work kind of in the private sector in Atlantic Canada. And so I kind of jumped on that. I'm from Moncton and kind of have family in Halifax and stuff. So I was eager to kind of get back east. So I kind of gave that a shot. I was successful in with my application. So I had to start a company and kind of get started working on creating some energy system models out east. And so yeah, that's sort of how Sutubra Research started. It was a bit in a rush, in a response to kind of a request to do some work that I was more or less doing, very related to what I was doing in my PhD. So kind of took a leave from the PhD, started the company, and haven't really looked back yet. It's been busy. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, and that was, I guess, three and a half years ago now.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Tell me exactly what is open source energy and what does that mean?
Yeah. So Sutubra Research, we do like a lot of energy analysis and modeling, and we use open source energy system models to accomplish that. And so there's quite a bit to unpack there, I'd say, and I guess we can kind of do it in two parts. There's the open source qualifier, and there's the energy or energy system model part of it. So maybe I'll just start briefly with what is an energy system model, and then we can talk about what does it mean for those to be open source. And so this energy system modeling, it's kind of a nebulous term. It's very big, and there's kind of a lot to it. And so I'll try to just chart it out for your listeners, as best I can. And so energy system models essentially are these large mathematical models that we kind of plug into computers that represent the energy system. And what do I mean by energy system? That's really any part of the economy that, say, produces, moves around, or consumes energy. And we often think about those as separate sectors. So there might be like the fuel supply sector, like the oil sands and refineries and things like this. There's end use sectors like buildings, or like residential buildings, commercial buildings, transportation. There's the electric power sector. There's industry. There's a whole bunch to it, right? In each of those sectors, we might represent a little bit differently with mathematical equations, trying to do our best to represent kind of the kind of driving or motivating forces behind the sector. How is energy used, produced, consumed, moved? What technologies are there, and so on. I think today we can just talk about power system model. We say energy system modeling. Power system models are sort of a subclass and really just focus on the grid, so electricity. We don't really care too much about buildings and transportation and so on. And I'm involved with both, but power system models a little bit easier to understand, and there's a lot to it, so we can kind of maybe limit the focus a little bit to those. And even within power system models, there's a whole bunch of different types, and we don't need to get into the weeds too much, but there's long-term planning models, and those kind of focus on, hey, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, how do we do that? What investments, what retirements are sort of required? What policies might support that, and so on. And there's a whole bunch of other models kind of going into more and more and more detail in terms of, there's sub-second kind of models that folks at the utility would use as well. But I don't really wade into that space. I'm focused more on the long-term models to say, how do we get, here's a target, how do we get there? What do we need to do in order to achieve that in terms of kind of investments? And so that's hopefully, not too confusing to summarize what are energy system models or what are power system models. And then, we'll talk now about that qualifier, open source. What's this? Maybe some of your folks have heard it. I say it's I hope it's becoming more and more popular. And open source software really is just more or less a legal term to say that software is open source in that it provides any users of it the right to kind of redistribute it, modify it, and have access to the entire code base. So all of the kind of, complicated stuff is there for the users. There's no licensing fees. It's free to use, and so on. And so maybe to make it a little bit concrete, we can talk about, Mozilla Firefox, the web browser, or the Python programming language. These are examples of open source software. You can kind of use it for free. You can modify it as much as you'd like. And so, and then together we have open source energy system models. And so, I think you can connect the dots. These are large kind of pieces of software, mathematical models that model, in our case, the power grid and all the physics and techno-economics behind it, but all of the code and the software is open. So if you wanted to, you could kind of browse all of the code that I've developed or co-developed with other folks around the world and kind of really get to see what sort of assumptions are in there. And so, there's lots of benefits to that. And there's lots of folks saying, well, maybe utilities ought to use open source models for their planning. Right now, many utilities, if not all, use proprietary models. And so it's really hard for us, the ratepayer or taxpayer, to understand what assumptions are going into their models to justify their investments. And so now you hear some regulators or governments are starting to advocate for utilities or for kind of folks in private sector to use open source or to open source license their models, so that in an effort to kind of increase transparency and trust in those processes.
Well, as energy generation is getting more efficient and it's constantly evolving, the models need to reflect this, or they do reflect this. This must keep you on your toes a lot.
It does. I mean, I think kind of right now we're a bit in the golden age of power system, energy system modeling, because like you said, so much is changing on the ground. Historically we had a really kind of predictable and inflexible electricity demand. And on the kind of generation side of things were fairly kind of simple as well. You had these large centralized power plants like coal or gas or nuclear, and we kind of knew how those work, and it didn't really matter where you plop them down. And so the modeling work to inform kind of optimal portfolios was fairly straightforward. In the 50s or 60s, you could do it with pen and paper using something called the screening curve analysis. And so things have changed, right? Both on the demand and the supply side. And in terms of demand, no one really knows what it's going to look like in the future as electric vehicles, heat pumps, other end uses are electrified. And flexibility increases. Folks might kind of have a smart thermostat that modifies their furnace or their heat pump depending on power prices or something, right? And on the supply side, wind and solar and batteries are way more complicated to model because they're variable. They depend on where you put them in time and space. It's a whole, it's complicated, and folks on kind of the modeling side are kind of, we're quickly responding. And this actually is a good example of why open source, why there's lots of benefits to it. If I had a big firm and we had our own proprietary model, we can only advance as fast as maybe the 8 people on our modeling team can work. Whereas in open source systems, I work a lot with and develop kind of large tools that has a global user base and a global kind of developer base. And so there might be hundreds of us that contribute to these projects. And so, I would say, argue we're really quick to respond to this because, well, A, there's a lot more of us, and B, we can all kind of audit each other's work. And so I think, there's been some research showing that these open source models have quickly caught up in sophistication, if not surpassed a lot of these kind of more legacy proprietary models that many utilities might still be using today.
Using math to solve problems, it's been around for a long time. It's nothing new. But what numbers, walk us through the process of what numbers and data do you crunch to create reports, for clients and for projects?
Good question. I mean, the short answer is a lot. A lot of the modeling process usually has several components, one of which is designing this model, the mathematical model of how things work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But those models are abstract, and you need to feed to them kind of data to say, well, what is the system in question, right? And so there's a lot of work in kind of gathering and processing the data for any given system. And so, for instance, we just finished some work doing some modeling for Atlantic Canada, and I'll kind of walk you through what that process might look like. And so there's several components. Like I said, you kind of develop the mathematical model, not just sort of sitting there waiting to be used. So now we need to kind of get all the data together, and there's several components of that in no particular order. The first is we need to figure out what's the load forecast, what we call it. What's electricity demand going to look like this year, next year, all the way out to say 2050, if that's how far we want to go out to. And so, you might have your own model that forecasts electricity demand, or you might take that data from someone else. If the utility provides that, you could use that, for instance. That gives you the data. Then you need to essentially get all the data that characterizes your resource options. So like your generators, your transmission lines, your storage technologies, right? And so for many of those generators, like coal generators, natural gas, nuclear, things like this, a lot of kind of big groups or national labs will report forecasts for how much they cost, how do they operate, what is their emission levels, that sort of stuff that we can use. But it's a little trickier to say quantify or characterize the wind resource in Nova Scotia. We can't just use data, say, from New York, folks in New York, because we have a different resource here. And so we build kind of pre-processing tools that takes a bunch of oftentimes satellite data for wind speeds and surface roughness, things like this. And we kind of crunch that and we kind of modify that into the data that we need, which is, well, what is the wind power here or the solar power here? So that's another tool. You get some more data in terms of kind of macroeconomic forecasts for exchange rates, inflation, things like this. And I guess the final piece would be your characterizing your fuel. So how much is gas going to cost? How much is, uranium going to cost, and so on. So you get all of that data together. It's a laborious task. You kind of put that together into kind of a single file that we might call a scenario. And then that's ready to be plugged into the model that we were talking about. That model will take its time. It crunches all the numbers. It determines the optimal solution in terms of costs, and it will spit out the answer. And that will kind of give you the pathway out to 2050 to say how to achieve, for instance, net zero power system in 2050 at least cost or something.
You have to do this because a lot of your clients, their eyes will probably glaze over with all the big numbers and all the big data. So you probably have to really kind of make it relatable to them for them to understand what that all means.
Totally. You got to, like as with everything in life, more or less, you kind of got to meet people where they are. And so I really enjoy kind of working in the more technical space. So a lot of my work kind of interface with kind of research groups at universities or at national labs and things, because I've just found out over time that's just sort of the space I enjoy operating in. And so we'll still write academic papers and keep things fairly technical, but certainly on some other projects, if we're working, say, for nonprofits, or even some large industrials, you got to figure out what their kind of language is and speak to them in that. And so that's sort of where the art comes in terms of taking all of our really granular results and trying to kind of use those to kind of paint a picture that the client or end user can understand. But
Yeah.
the nice thing about open source work, which I'm involved in, is that yes, we can still write the reports, but if you want, you can request everything, and we'll just, we're kind of legally bound to give you all of everything, even the model itself. So if you want to, you could probably get trained up on it and actually kind of run these things yourselves, which is kind of an added benefit as well.
A minute ago, you mentioned about net zero, and there's the push to become net zero by 2050. So, according to your numbers and what you know in the industry, are we on course to achieving this goal? And or what needs to happen to get to net zero? Are there any areas that are lacking?
Yeah, that's probably the most important. Well, I'd argue, kind of one of the most important questions we face, right?
Crystal ball. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, are we on track? Certainly not. But I remain an optimist. I think, I think a friend uses the term a conditional optimist. I'm optimistic, conditional on a few things, but me and a whole bunch of other people smarter than me are working hard on this problem, and so I remain optimistic. But I just finished some work with a group in the States, kind of charting out a path to net zero energy system for 2050, and so kind of been deep in the weeds on that. So I'll kind of speak to the States picture, knowing that Canada's similar, although we're different as well. But I think the kind of high level trends are fairly similar, where to get to net zero by 2050, our models can show us different ways to get there, right? And so things are going to have to change quickly. But I say there's a consensus between kind of different groups of modelers that how we probably should get there is that in the next 10 years we need to electrify many end uses, right? Transportation, heating of buildings, and so on. Simultaneously, we need to kind of replace, fossil fuel generators with clean ones: wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, geothermal. Okay, but not only that, since we're electrifying a lot of end uses, we not only need to kind of substitute our emitting power plants with clean ones, we also just need to grow the level of total kind of power production in on our grid. And so that means adding a lot more wind, solar, geothermal, maybe gas with carbon capture, whatever it is, and a lot more transmission. And so that over the next 15 years or so, till say 2035, that should get us we should be able to decarbonize, say, about 90%, 95% of our power sector. And that's, in fact, kind of in Canada, the new clean electricity regulations, that's more or less what they're trying to do through more of a kind of command and control approach. Now, if we do that, there's still other parts of the economy that we can't really just electrify simply, right? So that kind of electrification game will get us maybe about 2/3 of the way to a net zero economy. There remains about 1/3 of emissions, and that's from things like kind of industrial processes that we can't really electrify. They need really, really high grade heat, or they need fossil fuels as kind of a material input for chemicals and so on, or other things that really require the energy density that fossil fuels have, like aviation. It's going to be very tricky to, say, electrify, an Airbus, your plane over to Paris. And so that's another part of the economy where we're trying to figure out how do we make liquid or gaseous fuels that are net zero, right? So that's why I know you've probably chatted with some folks in the hydrogen economy. This is a big, I don't want to call it a buzzword. It's a big thing in Atlantic Canada and globally right now, and that's because folks have rightly recognized there's sectors of the economy that we can't simply electrify. We're going to have to figure out alternative solutions, and that might be hydrogen or hydrogen adjacent fuels like ammonia or methanol, or some other things like synthetic natural gas and so on. But the story is, the future is going to continue to have liquid and gaseous fuels. What those are is an open question. And there's some smart folks working on it. And then the very final part I would say is that there's still other areas of the economy, say agriculture, and still parts of industry and transport that we might never fully be able to decarbonize. And so we might, a lot of the models say we're going to require some what we call net negative technology. So these are things like direct air capture, or using biomass to produce hydrogen or electricity and things like this, that on the ledger, they actually kind of, in terms of their life cycle emissions, they remove more emissions or CO2 equivalents than they produce. And so we're going to need some of those net negative technologies unless we get some really more disruptive kind of other technologies that we can't really, fathom right now.
Interesting.
But yeah, I would say that's sort of the path. Getting there is going to be challenging, and we're going to have to build a lot, right? So
Yeah.
I think kind of putting that into practice is going to be the big challenge over the next 10 to 20 years.
Really great answers. So you work with utilities to support their integrated resource planning. What does this look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I will try not to get too boring here because I feel like this is a
It's been
topic that can really
fantastic.
get boring. So I guess power systems, you either have something like we have in Nova Scotia where you have a regulated utility,
Mhm.
right? Or you have kind of deregulated markets that exist, say, in Alberta, Ontario, Texas, quite a bit throughout the States. In Nova Scotia or any area that has a regulated utility, there's sort of a utility that has the duty to serve electricity reliably and affordably to its ratepayers, and you have the regulator that kind of holds them to account. And so how the business model works, a simplified version of the business model, is that the utility just gets a guaranteed return on any of their capital investments. And so they sort of have this incentive to build. And if they can build more expensive stuff to a degree, their investors get a better return. This is for investor-owned utility, which Nova Scotia Power is, and it's been a proven business model. It's worked kind of globally. I'm not trying to say it's or suggest it's a poor one. That's why you have the regulator, though, is that the regulator is there to advocate for us ratepayers to make sure that the utility is providing kind of an acceptable or a good level of service at the least cost, right? And they, up until now, don't care too much about emissions, but that's a separate conversation. Right now, it's about reliability and cost of service. So what happens is that the utility, if they want to build something, a new power plant, new transmission lines, they can't just go out and do it, right?
No.
They need to get that approved by the regulator. And they can't just go to the regulator and say, hey, we think it's a good idea to build X, Y, and Z. The regulator's going to say, well, prove it, justify these expenses. And so the utility does a whole bunch of work as part of their integrated resource planning. Kind of that's usually what we term it. These planning exercises or these integrated resource planning exercises, and this involves a lot of power system modeling. There's lots of components of it, but I'd say the kind of central pillar to it is these long-term power system planning models that we spoke about earlier, right? Looking out to say, the most recent IRP, integrated resource plan that Nova Scotia Power did, goes out to 2050, right? So these are kind of 30-ish year plans. And so they'll work with, consultants, or they'll have some in-house staff that kind of run these models and use these results. They bring these results to the regulator to essentially argue or justify that, no, this is in fact the best course of action. This is the most responsible investment, and so on. And so there's a lot of back and forth. The regulators will hire folks, real kind of domain experts, to come in and try to better understand or probe those results. And this, of course, is made a little bit more difficult because the utilities say, sorry, we can't turn this over, we can't turn that over, that's proprietary, or that's, we're using software whose license prohibits we share this, and so on. And so I think that's why we're starting to see a push from, say, regulators or governmental agencies saying, no, we should now kind of mandate open source models to make this whole thing a lot more transparent and a lot more easier for the regulator to do its job.
I'm really excited to hear about a project, that you're involved in with the province of Nova Scotia that's called the Long Duration Energy Storage Project.
Yeah.
Do you have any preliminary results that you can share?
I would say yes and no.
Okay.
So it's up until now has really been kind of working with some other colleagues to improve these power system models to better incorporate long duration energy storage. So these are technologies that kind of can get you through weekly lulls in wind duration, right? If we're going to have kind of a system in Nova Scotia largely based on wind, well, what happens when there's no wind for a week in January? It's unlikely, but it could happen, and we need to make sure that our system remains reliable, right? And without getting into the weeds, most models right now that we use, that utilities use, are sort of really bad at modeling that stuff because they need to make some simplifying assumptions around the time dimension. And so I'm working with some folks to essentially improve the models we have to better represent long duration energy storage. Now, this never used to be a huge problem because long duration, like multi-day, multi-week energy storage, never really was in the money. It never made sense. So why do we need to kind of rip up our models to improve them just to model this one resource? But that's sort of shifted now, right? These clean electricity regulations, other kind of government mandates, and on the kind of pull side, and then on the push side, you have cheaper and cheaper and cheaper technology, right? And so we're kind of at the point now where we need to be able to model this technology to see whether or not it can play an important role or any role at all in our future in Nova Scotia. And so I'm working with Lucas Swan, who's a professor at Dalhousie. He leads the Renewable Energy Storage Laboratory, and a student of his to they're kind of the technology experts. I'm the modeling expert. We're working together to kind of plug these in to understand, what role does this technology play, both in the power system and with hydrogen, right? If we're going to be producing a lot of hydrogen or kind of hydrogen derivatives here, those are great fuels for kind of seasonal storage to kind of ride us through some of those tough waves. So we're still kind of in the thick of modeling it. But we're interested because there's been a couple other colleagues in the States that have done similar reports recently that I'm kind of interacting with. And they see obviously in some scenarios that there is a role for these technologies to play. But, at the very least, we'll have these kind of up and running models that can really plug these long duration energy storage technologies into them as a resource option to kind of have an apples to apples comparison with other technologies like batteries or, hydrogen turbines and so on to fully understand, well, how, what is the most responsible way to get to net zero by 2050 in Nova Scotia and beyond.
Cameron, I really enjoyed speaking with you today. I'm amazed with the knowledge that you have, and coming from a person who is horrible at math, and you kind of take it and you make it easy, for people like us to understand what's going on, because the numbers don't lie, I guess, when you crunch it all together. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm interested to know what the future looks like, for Sutubra Research, and wishing you all the best.
Well, thanks so much. I had a lot of fun chatting with you.
Thanks so much for listening in today. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. And if you would like to sharing is caring, share this podcast to friends, family, colleagues, what have you. I'd love to be included into your listening time. Thanks so much. And also, if you're interested in being a podcast guest, go to our website, reimaginedenergy.com, and fill out a form. We'll get back to you lickety split. And thanks again. Until next time, I'm Maria McGowan.